So thanks everyone who's joined so far to our session, Participation to Power, Empowering Pathways to Women's Economic Empowerment. My name's Isabelle Gurney. I'm the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Advisor at the Pacific Women's Support Unit, based in Suva, but currently not there due to COVID. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm currently on the land of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So today we're going to be talking about women's economic empowerment in the Pacific context. Our program, Pacific Women, is wrapping up 8 years of programming, and we're in the process of reflecting together with all of our partners on what is effective in empowering women economically. And today's presentation is based on a forthcoming Pacific Practice Note paper with the same title as today's presentation. And it outlines essential elements of what works in the Pacific region. So I'd like to introduce our panellists who have very kindly agreed to join us for the session today. Today we have Elsie Mongoru from CARE Papua New Guinea. We have Priya Ieli from the UN Women's Markets for Change, and also Menka Goudan from the Menka from the Fiji Women's Fund. So thank you all very much for taking time out of your really busy and important schedules to share with us some of your experience and expertise working for women's economic empowerment and for gender equality. And I would like to also acknowledge that your work is you're extremely busy at the moment, given the current pandemic context in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. So before we hear from our speakers, I would like to frame what we'll be discussing today. So at the moment, women's economic empowerment is a major issue, much discussed and quoted in development circles. And throughout the Pacific region, government priority setting at a regional and national level has led to a gender equality policy agenda with a strong focus on women's economic empowerment. So the focus on women's economic empowerment is reflected at government, civil society and donor policy level, and it's embedded in national gender mainstreaming policies. So paired with an increasing awareness of gender equality and the current economic crisis in the Pacific driven by the pandemic, there is now an established government CSO and donor recognition and support for WE. However, despite this recognition, WE as a concept is quite poorly understood and poorly applied both in government and within CSOs and economic development circles. So empowerment is often used to describe women's economic participation in income generating activities, which are often insecure, low paid and labour intensive. So economic participation obviously has the potential to greatly enhance women's lives, as well as that of their families. But in order for economic participation to meaningfully address the empowerment elements of WE, it is critical to address gendered power dynamics. So many programs fall short of adequately assessing and addressing women's economic empowerment beyond maybe disaggregating participation by sex. And mainstream development discourse has regularly portrayed women's economic empowerment as an automatic win-win for economic development and for women's empowerment. However, this has not been the case and has not always been the experience of Pacific women's partners. And partners have found that the non-financial dynamics of women's empowerment, such as leading, influencing and organising, are also absolutely critical as well. So at Pacific Women, we call this the forgotten E of women's economic empowerment. And what you can see on the screen are key elements Pacific Women has identified over 8 years of programming that enable programs to address gendered power dynamics through women's income generation. So some of these critical elements that require deliberate action are addressing women's unpaid care and unpaid domestic work. So unpaid care work and unpaid household labour is likened to slavery by some women. And women's unpaid domestic workload, like most of the world, is far higher in the Pacific for women than it is for men. Also addressing social norms and stereotypes is absolutely critical. Increasing women's leadership, never ignoring the impacts of violence, including the risks in economic development programming and the increased risks of harm. Supporting collectives to build women's collective agency, and that's an area we'll be going into in some depth today. Recognising the barriers that economically disempower women and marginalised groups, and ensuring that employment is safe, fair and regulated. And this includes avoiding economic development through cheap labour and lack of social protection, as our colleagues this morning at ActionAid in this morning's session highlighted so clearly. So we as Pacific women, Australian researchers, feminists, academics and community workers know this. And we know that we involves more than just women's economic participation. But translating this awareness built through practical experience into practice has not always been easy, particularly in the face of an agenda which takes a smart economics approach to women's participation in the economy and frames women as untapped resources waiting to grow the economy. How do we economically support women and maintain a focus on women's increase in power? And that's the name of this session, Participation to Power. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. How do we actually translate this theory into practice and what actually works in the Pacific context? And our panelists, Menka, Elsie and Priya, are going to explore this further in their presentations on their respective programs. And then after that, we're going to have a question and answer session and a discussion in the second half of the session. So first, I'd like to invite Menka to tell us about the work of the Fiji Women's Fund and a little bit about their unique approach to small granting, which has had major transformative impact for the women that the fund works with. Welcome, Menka.
Thanks, Isabelle. So my name is Menka Goudan, and like Isabelle said, and as you can see on the screen, I work at the Fiji Women's Fund. The Fiji Women's Fund is a grant-making and capacity support program for the women's movement in Fiji. And we have currently worked with, in the last 4 years, 38 grantee partners across Fiji. And we continue to have vision to work in Fiji. We've been initiated as a 5-year program by the Australian government through the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Program. And as we speak, we're currently in the process of localizing or registering in Fiji as an independent entity. So that's me, and that's what the Fiji Women's Fund does. Now, moving on, I'll just draw on further on what Isabelle has said regarding women's economic empowerment and their participation to power. And it's rightly so that a lot of the women's economic empowerment programs that we have encountered, we have seen that the program merely works towards women's economic participation and not really empowerment. Now, what I have on the screen is a lot of the terms that we usually see in the Pacific, used as developmental jargon, used to describe a lot of the women's economic empowerment programs. We talk about long-term impact. We talk about capacity support. We talk about collaboration. We talk about supporting collectives. Gender equality and social inclusion has become quite the fancy term in the last few years. And in a lot of the economic work, we talk about diversification. So what does all these things mean? What do they look like in practice? So like Isabelle said, and I'll draw your attention back to participation in the format of us working with a particular grantee partner. So one of the grantee partners we've had in the last 4 years, and we've continuously worked with them, is a collective of women dairy farmers called the Naithasiri Women in Dairy. Now, Naithasiri is province in the interior of Vitilevu, one of the major islands of Fiji. And these are women dairy farmers who are located there. So they were participating in economic activity through being women dairy farmers in their family-owned farm units. So the participation was there when we started working with the group. In the last 4 years, what we have done is we've continuously worked with them to reach long-term impacts. So long-term impacts include the ability for these women to work in a collective, create a communal safety net for themselves, which builds their confidence, which builds their skill in terms of negotiating, and which helps them to access decision-making. So what we have seen is the women in the 4 years have now been able to move towards accessing decision-making tables like the dairy cooperative or the Ministry of Agriculture, so the dairy sector farmers association within that. And for women farmers, it's a major boost. It's a big step. It's a big leap towards being in national decision-making processes. And women feel safer operating as collectives. Hence, the fund supports small grants to women as collectives rather than individual women-led businesses. What the communal safety net does is provides them with the opportunity to work together, to support each other. They also, by supporting each other, they also are able to support each other in an indigenous approach that they've used in relation to what they call Solesolovaci, basically helping each other in their farms. So those are some of the ways they're supporting each other. And even we've seen instances where communal violence, communal backlash, even domestic violence stories come out in that collective since they feel safer to share these. As part of the long-term approach, and given the climate crisis in the Pacific, it's what we see for dairy farms and what we project for dairy farms is the fact that the warming climate will result in the long run in lesser lactation for cows. So that means that whilst, yes, we're building infrastructure, we're building their knowledge in terms of dairy farming, but the income levels will depreciate in the long run. So how do you adapt to this situation? How do you diversify? So through capacity support, the fund has had women from Naitasiru Women in Dairy attend an institute we have here in Fiji on farming June cow mushroom, which works well as a cow feed and also has become a diversified income for the women dairy farmers. So you see, what we're talking about here is going beyond participation of women in economic activity. We're talking about building resilience for women, adapting to the realities of women, taking a very localized approach, building their own capacity to do work for themselves, so that even in the future, when they stop applying for funding from the Fiji Women's Fund, or when they become a self-sufficient entity, they're able to manage their resources and manage their farms. It's also giving them financial autonomy. While what economic participation does is, because women, given the patriarchal society that we live in, and most Pacific Island countries are patriarchal, you don't have land resource, like in this case, because these women are also part of family farm units. When you diversify, for instance, with their mushroom production, that income is solely theirs, because they're the ones who are farming mushroom and they don't have to contribute to the family income, which is the dairy farm. So in that way, the diversification also has helped them to reach a level of financial autonomy. So it's going beyond the participation. Now they can make decisions in relation to how they can spend money, how the money can be spent in their homes, And so and what they want to invest in to garner their future. So there's all sorts of things that come into play when we talk about women's economic empowerment. So yeah, so I just wanted to add that, and you see how this has made or this creates a semblance of shared power among the community. Now these women are in decision-making structures. They share the power in those structures of decision-making. They have a voice and an agency. And then also within their homes as well, because they have financial autonomy, they can also share the power in their homes as well in terms of decision-making. So that's breaking the barriers that these women had before, that just economic participation would not have necessarily done for them. That is my take on that.
Thanks so much, Menka. I'm now going to invite Elsie to tell us about the coffee industry support program she manages. So we're shifting from Fiji to Papua New Guinea. Using a gender transformative framework, the coffee industry support program has had considerable success in increasing gender equality amongst farming families in the highlands of PNG. Thanks, Elsie. You're still on mute. That's it.
Okay, like it says on the screen, my name is Elsie Mongoru. I'm the program manager for the economic empowerment programs for K International in Papua New Guinea. And the coffee industry support project is one of the projects that I manage. I'm going to talk about the gender empowerment framework that we use to design our projects around and how we've used it in the coffee industry support project in Papua New Guinea. We call it CISP, Coffee Industry Support Project, is specifically designed to improve economic and social well-being for women coffee farmers in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. But before I talk about the project, I wanted to just give a small, very, very brief background on coffee in Papua New Guinea. So coffee is one of the largest agricultural commodities in Papua New Guinea with an estimated annual earnings of about 450 million kina. Traditionally, coffee is viewed as a men's business, basically because they own the land that the coffee is grown on, or they inherit coffee trees from their fathers. Coffee income, there's a lot of, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, coffee income is predominantly the main source of income for a lot of families. I think earlier this year, the government of PNG also announced a 7 million kina subsidy to boost the price of coffee. So most households in the highlands are basically going to get more money from their coffee. So that's just a small background about coffee in Papua New Guinea. When we say it's a men's business, that doesn't mean that women don't play a role. Women have a very important role, but basically it's around participation and the amount in terms of putting in labor for processing and growing coffee. So with the project, we wanted to look at how women can benefit more in terms of economic resources from coffee or from income from coffee, especially at the household level. So we use this, the equality framework. It's not showing on my screen, sorry.
Okay, is it showing now, Elsie?
Yeah, okay. So this is the framework that we used. It's a K International framework called the Gender Equality Framework. So we looked at 3 domains within this framework to design the project. So First one is around building women's agency. So looking at increasing knowledge, skills, and confidence to engage in livelihood activities. So this is basically looking at not only in terms of coffee extension work, but also looking at livelihood activities outside of coffee. So so same thing as Menka was talking about. So in terms of looking at coffee, additional income from other sources. So we introduced ideas of VSLA, where we look at village savings and loans. We also looked at the second domain within framework is relationships. So basically looking at power relationships and power dynamics within a family unit, as well as communities. So looking at how helping smallholder farming families work together. So using, we have two approaches that we use in this. One is the family business management training. So looking at how families can work together to earn an income and make decisions around how they grow their business, or the family coffee business. And then we look at the model farming families also, where farming families are selected to be models of, so they teach other families on how they're making decisions together, how they're sharing workloads together. So our project is basically a family-based approach project. So we work through families. The last part of this domain is talking about structures, so building capacity for coffee industry in Papua New Guinea. So through the Coffee Industry Corporation, which is the governing body for coffee in Papua New Guinea, as well as large export companies for coffee, especially those based in Goroka. So we look at how we can mainstream gender equity in policies and practices within coffee industry, within the big players with coffee in Papua New Guinea. So we look at a lot of support to them in terms of giving extension officers more gendered, more knowledge around gender and how they can appropriately include women in the trainings that they provide when they go out to provide extension services. We've seen a lot of promising results, especially at the household level, by using this in terms of shared workloads with men and women within families. So more women are reporting that the men are taking more caregiving or household responsibilities, and women feel like they have more influence in decision-making around household finances. We've seen some results also in terms of working with the Coffee Industry Corporation, so changing mindsets around women's contribution at the workplace as well. We've looked at introducing a graduate development program for female extension officers. Most in PNG, extension work is considered a men's role. So most times it's the men that provide extension services. So by introducing a female graduate program for extension officers, we introduced the idea that women can also be extension workers. And then it sort of it sits very well because because of cultural norms within the community, women are not allowed to talk to other men. So when females are extension workers, we get a lot more coffee husbandry knowledge being passed on to women, who are basically the ones that do all the work around growing and processing of coffee. Yeah, I think that was all I prepared for this introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Elsie. I just wanted, we've got just a quick question, might as well answer now. That's why
Okay.
we're about how village saving groups benefit women, so women coffee farmers. I guess that's probably sort of thinking about how does the cooperative structure work, and how because CARE, obviously it works with the cooperatives as well as the individuals, as well as the coffee corporations and the government. So perhaps if you could just highlight how village cooperatives include and benefit women.
Okay, so the way we run village savings and loans in our cooperatives is, so we have savings groups for only women, and then we have savings groups that are for only men, and then we have savings groups that are a mixture of both men and women. So we try to, in that way, we foster leadership for women for the corporate, for the savings groups. So in the female savings groups, only women will be leading this group and then directing what happens and then setting a constitution for the group. So in that way, women do take part in leadership roles, so they get an idea of how to be a leader. And then within mixed groups, we also promote the idea that, okay, we need to also include women who might be making the decisions around the savings group constitution. In terms of how it benefits women, women are able to put into, in PNG, financial inclusion services, or basically access to financial services for women is very limited. So a lot of, I think 83% of the bank accounts in Papua New Guinea are owned and operated by men. So most of the time women don't have access to financial services, so they don't have that practice. So by doing this in a community, they do get the practice on how to save money, how to take out loans. So when they take out these loans from their savings groups, they're able to sort of venture into doing something else, another small business within a village. Maybe they come to town, they buy store goods, and then they go back to the community, to their villages, and then they sell it for an additional income. So that way we're able to benefit women. So they have additional income that is considered their own and not part of the family income that they get through the selling of coffee.
Great. Thanks very much, Elsie.
Thank you.
We'll move down up the supply chain and go over to Priya. I'd like to welcome Priya from Markets for Change, and to hear a little bit more, to tell us a little bit more about Markets for Change, highly successful approach to empowering women market vendors across the Pacific for 8 years. And Markets for Change is just about to, or may have just already, begun a new phase of programming as well, building on the success of phase 1. Thanks, Priya.
Thanks so much, Isabelle. Sorry, due to weak internet connection, I'll just have to switch off my video so I can continue to speak. I hope that's fine. Okay, thank you so much. In terms of the Markets for Change project, it is a multi-year project which commenced in April 2014. And the project is actually aimed at ensuring marketplaces in the rural and urban areas in Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Samoa was a recent inclusion to ensure that markets are safe, inclusive, and non-discriminatory environments, promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. The project promotes gender equality through the economic empowerment of women market vendors. And as we all know, between 70 to 90% of market vendors in the Pacific are women. So it makes sense to be working with this focal group. And the project brings together governments, market vendors, and market vendor associations, together with civil society organizations and UN agencies. And the project is implemented by UN Women in partnership with UNDP through the generous funding of the governments of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. If you can move on to the next slide. In terms of the Market for Change project, there are 4 outcome areas. And in terms of the 4 outcome areas of the project, we represent the project's approach to reducing key barriers to women's economic empowerment through a rights-based approach. So working with the market vendors as rights holders and the government as duty bearers. And the first outcome actually promotes market vendors' leadership and sustainable organizations that continue to advocate for improved working conditions. The second outcome actually builds on the capacity as well as finding solutions to improve the access to financial services, financial literacy, improved and climate smart agricultural practices, and also bringing in service providers to the market environment. Through the third outcome, we work with the governments to ensure that the improvements to the working conditions in the markets are based on gender analysis and market vendors' needs. And the fourth outcome area is all about improving the physical spaces of markets, including ensuring they are disaster and climate resilient. So with this, just a bit more on what the project actually does in terms with empowering women. As we all know, many women's economic empowerment projects are actually just about advancing women economically, basically focused on raising the economic status. But Markets for Change project works on the empowerment component, whereby ensuring that market vendors have voice and agency. And what that means is that the market vendors have an avenue through the market vendor associations to raise their issues, to advocate and negotiate for improvements. They have the agency, which means that the decision-making power lies within them and the associations that have been created to provide solutions, raise grievances, and act on those. So through the project, we were able to create and grow market vendors associations across 21 municipal markets. So across the 3 countries, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, we work with 21 municipal and provincial councils. Initially, when the project started, we were met with some defunct and ad hoc associations in place, mostly headed by men. And it's a wonder that, majority of the market vendors are women. However, these groups were all headed by men at the time. However, this has changed over the years, and now we have majority women-headed market vendors associations across the 3 countries, with the associations formally registered to have their constitutions in place. So women market vendors have also taken charge of the associations and assumed their leadership roles with active leadership and participation. With the work, we have seen that women market vendors, through the leadership roles in the Market Vendors Association, have become more confident, vocal, and are seen practicing their rights at many levels. They are now being invited to national and regional meetings and conferences to talk about their experiences and their journeys. And we now frequently see women market vendors being interviewed, especially in Fiji, in the news and other media. The project has supported women vendors to raise issues, and the associations ensure that women's voice are heard, and women have the agency to make decisions and to apply those decisions. The power dynamics in the markets really shifted with the inclusive approach of the project, where women along with men were encouraged to work together in the market space. For example, when I say men, these are men market vendors and also council management. And most of us would know that municipal councils basically are male-dominated environment. So making a breakthrough was quite important here as well. And now we have seen that men at the market, they have more respect and understanding of women's needs, and are now positively, for example, advocating for gender responsive solutions for market planning and management. We also feel that giving women voice and agency in their workplace, in our case, the marketplace, it has meant a lot in terms of how they can advocate for their issues, giving them that voice to raise the issues that mean a lot to them. And these also include some very practical issues like, advocating for adequate lighting, fencing, starting up market safety committees to be in the markets, having, taps and running water at accessible and safe locations, etc. So we have seen that in the marketplace, promoting them and advocating on their leadership roles. These are some of the things we have seen happening in a positive way. And with UNDP as a partner, they work in the socioeconomic space of the project. And they have provided trainings on financial literacy, business record keeping, diversification of produce and business opportunities, value addition, climate smart practices, and all of this have worked, in favor of economic advancement of women market vendors. Initially the municipal councils and market vendors would only meet when they had disagreements or issues. However, over time, we have seen both stakeholders. They are meeting at timely intervals to hold like consultative meetings to discuss plan and action items at the market for the betterment of all, gender responsive budgeting practices being adopted by some of the market councils and markets. And not only that, consultation with market vendors at various levels, including the national government as well. And the most recent one was the budget and COVID-19 pandemic consultation, which just took place this week with the market vendors associations and the Attorney General in Fiji. So to us, these are some, indications on the recognition of the market vendors associations and the leaders by leaders at the various levels. Also, in terms of the objective of the project, it was to create an enabling environment for the women market vendors at the market. And this was done through ensuring that the project addressed the multiple barriers women face to advance economically and to be empowered economically. Through the project, the support was initially to start small scale with infrastructure improvements, focusing on the safety and security elements of the market. However, with the category 4 cyclones, battering the Pacific infrastructure, infrastructure projects later involved building entire new markets in some cases. And we also found that with this multi-pronged approach, the construction of accommodation centers and better and improved physical market space added an advantage for the rural women to not only expand their economic returns, but also having access to an accommodation center, which meant they could spend more time at the market with a safer environment. So this outcome, however, has been scaled back for the next phase of the project. All in all, I just want to conclude with this. The women's economic empowerment actually includes the women's ability to participate equally in existing markets in terms of the Markets for Change project, and their access to and control over productive resources, along with the access to decent work, control over their own time, lives, and bodies, and increased voice and agency and meaningful participation in economic decision at all levels, for the household to international institutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Priya, for that outline of all the huge amount of work and the different phases that Market for Change has gone through over the last 8 years, and the building on learning and the sort of transformation that it certainly seems to have, starting out as a purely focused on economic advancement, and the program just, it got bigger and bigger, building women's leadership on market vendor associations, even to the extent that there were women going for local council elections, and the incredible amount of influencing skills and negotiation skills that women gained through the program is quite remarkable. It's now sort of morphed into a very successful women's leadership program as well. And I think that sort of highlights the importance of and I know this is the case from what I've heard from Elsie in the CARE program as well, but sort of mainstreaming a gender equality approach through other activities. And that's where the most success happens, is when when gender equality is taken out of the gender box and mainstreamed through wider aid commitments and government programs and development programs as well. We do have time for questions, so please feel free to pop your questions in into the Q&A box. We do have several coming through already. I do want to just build on what what Priya was talking about just then around markets for change. So as we've sort of highlighted, Markets for Change has been outstanding in its success building women's leadership at the community level. But I know that there's been in the evaluation and reflection over the years of the program, there's been major challenges in supporting women to have control over their own income, because it was found that women in market vendors, while being supported to increase their income and to take part and speak up in community and market associations and forums, would return home and not and hand their money straight over to their husband and not have control over or input into or be able to make decisions over how that money was spent. So Priya, I was wondering, how will Markets for Change increase women's household decision making in power in the next stage of the program?
Thanks, Isabelle. Through the phase 2 of the project, which we have actually developed the project documents and sent it to donors, and we have received feedback. So it's looking quite positive. With the project, with the phase 2 project, there is a key focus on women's economic empowerment at the household level and community level. And we have developed a toolkit in close consultation with CARE International, which is very similar to the household business model training toolkit. And the plan is to roll this out under phase 2. And from the learnings of phase 1, introduce the same inclusive model of women and men to be involved in the trainings and capacity development to ensure that there is positive buy-in from the male folks at the household level as well. Mm-hmm. We already have anecdotal evidence and also evidence from our project monitoring from phase 1 that there has already been some positive developments at the household level, with families being able to purchase land, farming assets, diversify their business, and send their children to tertiary schools from improved earnings. So this is an indication already that, in terms of household decision making, women having more agency and voice at the household level is already part of what's happening. But we want to take this forward in a more calculated and inclusive manner. So promoting, women's voice and agency. Sorry, just to add, there has been evidence that with women's improved economic empowerment, there can be issues with race in GBV issues as well. So we are working with our EVOLVE team to include primary prevention teachings to be part of the approach to ensure that we do curb the issue of GBV as best as we can, whilst taking these trainings and learnings to women's voice and agency to the household level. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. And I also wanted, and just to highlight, GBV is gender-based violence. So Priya was referring to to research actually that indicates that the risk of violence increases when women's economic activity and income increases. So I would love to hear a little bit more, Menka, going back to what you were talking about before, and how the Fiji Women Fund supports mainly collectives, including women's savings clubs and mothers groups and village associations. Why is it so important to support collectives in women's economic empowerment?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Isabelle. So the importance of supporting collectives is the concept of what I talked about in terms of creating communal safety nets. What we find is for women to go from that level of participation to empowerment, there is a greater need for women to be able to have that voice and agency to be able to participate in economic activities. So in terms of voice and agency, 2 years ago, actually, we co-authored the fund co-authored a publication called Promising Practices, which looks at working in collectives with 3 of our grantee partners who work in the area of women's economic empowerment. So these are Rise Beyond the Reef, Talanoa Tracks, and Rana Parishad. So what we saw was, and something that Talanoa Tracks talked about in the example was that women felt safer to operate as a collective. So when going to the registries to register their businesses, or going to the bank, or just going and doing regular orders, etc., they felt safer if they operated in a pair or in threes rather than going alone, or rather than operating alone. So it gave them more confidence. It boosted the fact that they have a support mechanism with them. So it made them more, it gave them positive vibes really of operating. So we saw that in the first year, women started operating in this way. And then once they had already gotten that confidence that, yeah, I can go to the bank and do the banking, or I can go and take up orders, or I can, I know how to do a business license because I've done it before with the group. They started sort of doing it on their own and started venturing out into businesses on their own, but still remaining with that collective. And so while they were increasing their income in other ways, but the collective was still their foundation to bounce off those ideas, to seek help, to get questions. When there was a challenge they were facing, they knew through their collective discussions that they were not facing these challenges alone. They were facing it as a group. So it created that communal safety net. I mean, what we see in a lot of the, what you were alluding to in traditional economic participation projects is we appoint what we call advisors or mentors. But these advisors or mentors may not be available in the community, or not even probably speak your native language all the time. But if these are people who are available to you, you have a relationship with them and are able to access these people within your community, speak your language, be in your context. So a very localized approach, you muster the courage to continue to do that work and succeed together. So it becomes a communal journey. So it's the whole idea of creating a communal safety net.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Promising Practices paper is available on the fund's website. So if anyone wants to read more about that.
Thanks, Menka. Oh, sorry, I've just lost the screen. I'm seeing that we actually only have 10 minutes left, which is very sad because there's a lot more to discuss. But we had a couple of questions around market linkages relating to the coffee farming, Elsie. But I just thought perhaps it would be helpful, and there was also a question about the household labour and household work that women undertake and the care work. It would be great if you could highlight a little bit more about how the family farms teams work and how it's and how typically it works with a husband and wife team, and to increase the productivity of the coffee farming. So it's not necessarily about individually linking women up to coffee markets. It's about increasing the family decision-making and the decision-making between husband and wife together, who are already accessing that, but to improve the women's life, I guess their experiences and also the level of work they do. So Elsie, if you wouldn't mind just taking us through some of how CARE actually practically does that, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so the question around access to markets, we don't work in access to markets, so we don't do that work. We only look at working with women-led cooperatives if we do have women-led cooperatives that we're working in. and trying to ensure that they're meeting the industry standards for certification for export. So in that way, we try to ensure that women are accessing markets, or women coffee farmers. In terms of the family business management or the family-based approach to what we do, we ensure that, the FBMT basically gives women validation to participate in community trainings, access extension services, because other men are saying that, yes, women are participating in these trainings alongside their husbands. They're learning things that are contributing to the improvement of their families, as well as increasing the amount of money they're getting from coffee. So there's a lot of stories that we're collecting from participants from these trainings that say they previously, while only women were doing the caregiving work in the home, so the household duties, and also working in the garden and doing processing for coffee, the picking the cherries and the drying and the pulping, the production for coffee at the household level was low. So they were looking at 6 to 10 bags of coffee. But when men started getting involved and taking over some of the caregiving roles within the home, as well as helping the women do other things in the coffee garden, the coffee production at the household level actually increased to sometimes more than 30 bags. So in that case, a lot of the communities are seeing that, okay, by having the women participate and having this idea of, we're sort of promoting the idea of family well-being by including the women as well as the husband and probably other male and female members of the family, the production and income from coffee actually increases. So that way we give validation for women to actually be part of this, part of the trainings that are happening at the community level. Not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does, because it was useful to go into how it actually, what it sort of looks like on a more, for women who actually participate. So thank you very much, Elsie. We had another question. Oh gosh, maybe we don't. Do we have time? Sorry, I'm just going to have a look for it. Oh, it was for you, Menka, but I'm not sure if you answered it or not. But how, and I think it would be interesting for everyone to hear this, but how does the fund, and if you could just keep the answer to like 1 minute, how does the fund select the organisations that it works with, because acknowledging that it's a very diverse selection of organisations in some very remote places?
Yep. So the fund has 3 types of grants: sustainability, movement building, and resilience. Sustainability and movement building is open through grant call each year, and for sustainability, that's the type that we usually, that's where the Women's Economic Empowerment Long-Term Impact Program sit. It's a 2-step process to access those grants. When you do in the grant call, you can do an EOI. These EOIs, simple Word doc, not more than 2 pages long. We have translated these forms, so you can, we've had applications coming through phone. People have walked in and just explained the idea, and we filled the EOIs for them, etc., etc. These EOIs go to a grants committee made up of 4 women from the women's movement, who narrow it down to a core group of EOIs invited for proposals. Again, the fund team goes out to these local communities, helps these groups to write these proposals, prepare their due diligence documents, etc., and presents it back to the grants committee. The grants committee then makes a decision. For some groups who don't even get the grants, but we see that they can, they have a potential for the next round, etc. We've also helped them with capacity support so that they're able to spend the next 12 months before the next grant call to build their capacity so that they're strengthened enough to qualify for a grant. So that's the way it works. The decision making is with a diverse 4 women-led group of grants committee.
Thanks, Menka, and I think it's
the fastest I could explain.
Oh yeah, there's an answer down there. But also, I think it's also worth mentioning that the Fiji Women's Fund led by Menka and her colleagues, they also, you know, experiment with some really fantastic and creative ways of ensuring that their granting mechanism is accessible to a diverse range of women and mainly women, and it's also, and they're using a lot of different techniques, such as, you know, verbal reporting and the way that they spread the message in terms of they're going beyond the sort of existing structures to make sure that they're accessible to remote areas, which is really remarkable and worth checking out some of the reports on the website as well. So I'm going to have to finish up because we only have 4 minutes. Thank you so much, Menka, Priya and Elsie, and thank you to participants for your questions. We could keep talking about this all day because these are huge and complex programs with massive amounts of effort and thought that have gone into them and still go on, as well as practical labour. So I'm just very quickly going to share my screen again. So this slightly unusual picture here is actually of our Women's Economic Empowerment Snakes and Ladders game, and we've just released this yesterday onto our website. So it's possible to play via Zoom and also live. It's a great game to play with partners. It's an excellent tool to explore all the complex elements around we in a really simple, fun way. And this is part of Pacific Women wrapping up 8 years of programming, and we've been reflecting on these essential elements to economic empowerment based on the experience of, I think, 176 initiatives and 164 partners over 8 years. And we're also in the process of completing sets of practice notes, videos and case studies highlighting what we've learned and the work of our partners. And these learning products are going to be released through public learning events and on our website over the next few months. So to conclude, I guess I hope that you found this an interesting session, and I'd like to reiterate that these changes in women's status and power are not automatic through economic development and economic growth. And the non-financial dynamics of women's empowerment, including leading and influencing and organising, are just as critical for sustainable and meaningful economic development and gender equality. And it's critical that women's programs, as well as wider economic development initiatives, go beyond participation to deliberately addressing power dynamics and empowerment. Because as we know, gender inequality in all aspects of life contributes to higher poverty, and economic insecurity rates amongst women are much higher than they are for men. So women's economic empowerment, meaningfully addressed, is therefore critical to realising women's rights, which is why we're also passionate about this area, and also to achieving sustainable and equitable economic development. So thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed our session, and do have a look at our website for more discussion of all of these projects, as well as our women's economic empowerment specific practice notes and analysis, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.